Hey everybody, JMac here. Had an interesting mock I wrote earlier when I was pairing with a client to backfill some tests for their Laravel application. Now I've anonymized everything here, but I made generically the same controller with the method to demonstrate kind of the point. So ultimately it's mocking of this particular document store and the complex argument validation necessary to just give you the confidence that this method is behaving the way that you want. So just as a quick overview, it's effectively injecting a document store that's being resolved from the container. It's validating some document IDs that come in as an array. They need to exist in the database. It fetches those out of the database and then passes them along to this archive to theoretically, move them in S3 buckets, soft delete them, whatever it might do, this document store. And that's the piece we want to mock out. While we're willing to actually make the request with Laravel's helpers, use factories to allow it to talk to an SQLite database, all of these eloquent things are working, actually real underneath the covers, all that's fine, but this actual document store, we can test that separately. We don't necessarily want to do that. So because of its injection, it's super easy to mock, but what became complex is, again, just that last bit of confidence to make sure that those were the documents that are going to be archived, and ultimately to give us that reference so we can compare the response, gave us that back, as well as the proper status code. So I removed the test over here just to kind of start roughly from the beginning. I've generated the test, I've given it a name, I've changed the request to be post to that particular route, but everything else other than turning on or turning off the exception handling so we can see these errors as we work along the way, or the full stack trace, it'll be helpful to kind of, again, dive in and isolate this one piece that we're missing. So let's go ahead and start this up. I think this request validation, so forth, is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to make two documents here. So the first one is just a factory for document, and we'll send it the right class, and we'll just create that, and we will just replicate this line. And we'll just call this document 2. We actually don't need these, anything special about these other than really just to send them along and perform some of the assertions. So I'm just going to let the fake data do its job. So we call this documents. We're going to make sure to pass that into our post request. And it's simply an array of integers, of course, that need to exist in the database. So this is going to be our happy path for validation. And that's all we're going to focus on right now. So let's just say document 1 ID and document 2 ID. It doesn't really matter the order, so we'll just go in order. And ultimately, we want to assert a 202 here, right? And we could go so far as to check the reference, and we will, but let's pause there for a second, run this test, and we'll basically see that we're going to run into this mock issue. Now, if I actually had one in my application, it would obviously bind to the concrete version of that and run and try to perform whatever the document store did when you called archive. Now, again, I've replicated this and anonymized it, so I don't have a real implementation. Further proof of how cool and easy these tests are to create with Laravel. So let's just make a mock. We're going to pass it the interface, or in this case the contract for the document store, and we'll save that as a document store. And now we've bound one, and our error message is going to be, hey, archive is mocked out, but there were no expectations specified. So let's go ahead and set one of those up, but first I'm going to tag this with a var doc block for a mockery mock. There it is. And now I should get some better completion with PHP Storm. So let's say document source should receive archive. And let's just go, again, the easy way here before we identify kind of the problem. And so what I want to do is maybe just return some kind of like UUID for this reference. I could return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I like to vary test data when I can, especially because, again, Laravel just makes this super easy. So let's do faker UUID. Now I don't have faker, but I can tack on this helpful trait, again, given by Laravel. With faker, and now that's going to give me a faker property on my test class. So let's run this, and we're passing. Now, two things. One, it's kind of a soft assertion down here. It's just a 202. So let's tighten that up. Let's say assert JSON, and this is going to be a reference. And that should, if everything worked correctly, again, our mock loop ran through, meaning we got the right documents, we called archive, we got back the reference, and it ultimately was sent back. We should get that same UUID that Faker gave us and that we are returning from the document store mock when archive is called. So let's get a proper semicolon there and run this again. And we are still passing. Great. Now, most people might leave it here. And here's my issue with that. Let me just change what I'm passing in here, for example, to just be an empty array. And when I run the test again, I'm still passing. Now that's not right. I can't just pass anything I want in here. I need to pass the specific documents that were found or eloquent returned from the request input. So I want to have a bit of a stronger matcher here. Now you could push this with some of the loose matching that's in Mockery. So for example, I could say something like Mockery type has to be a collection, a collection class. There we go. And if I run this again, it's going to complain at least now that no expectations, were met because I'm passing that in. But again, I could keep playing this game and pass in a collection and everything's going to pass again. So I want to make sure it's exactly those documents that were returned. Now, it can't be exactly these faked documents because it's going to be whatever I set here in the database is going to be pulled out different. So those object references aren't going to match. So what I can do is test that those documents IDs match. And I would have pretty relative certainty there that, or at least feel a lot more confident that that is behaving correctly. So again, I need to make sure that even though these are pulled back from the database and even though that's really happening, I need to make sure that it returned the right things. I don't want to have a where clause in here or someone to add that earlier and my test not pick up on that. So I want to tighten this up just a bit. And I can do that with a complex argument matcher. They have a closure called on. And let me just bring up the documentation here under argument validation. And again, I've already kind of hinted at that, but it's actually what they call it. It's a complex argument validation. And it allows us to use a closure to either return true or return false based on the argument that came in. So it gives us a chance to kind of capture that argument and perform some validations on it. So similar concept here, we're just going to pass in a closure. It's going to receive the argument. And inside here, we want to perform some kind of validation, again, to make sure that we're certain that what it received were indeed these documents. So what we can do is, this is ultimately an eloquent collection. So we could say, hey, that argument, we're going to pluck those IDs, and we could get all of those and just make sure that it's equal to the document, or well, really, we don't need to type all that. We can just borrow this down here. So there we go. PHP is going to be unhappy because in the local scope of the closure, it doesn't know what those are. So let's go ahead and pass those in with the closure use statement. And let's also get that semicolon. Cool. So let's just recap here. We're going to take that collection argument that we captured. That's going to be passed to the archive method. We're going to pluck those IDs to give us a collection of just the IDs. We're going to call all to turn that into an array and get all of the items in the collection. And we're going to kind of loosely compare that to make sure that it matches our same fake data IDs. So we're going to run this and everything passes. Now, again, if we're going to go through all this trouble, let's make sure that this is absolutely correct. So I could, again, with this loose comparison, change the order of these, and I'm starting to fail. Now, does the order really matter what's passed to archive? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That's up to you to decide. I'm just showing the limitations of the closure and how we want to make sure to make this strong but yet flexible. So maybe the order doesn't matter. Maybe the primary keys or the documents, they're different in the real world. So let's loosen this up by just getting a difference between the documents and seeing if that collection is empty. So what we're doing is the same thing. We're getting a collection of just the IDs. We're comparing that using a difference to our own document ID array. And if that resulting collection, meaning if the difference is empty, meaning there is no difference, then we're all good. So let's run that, and we're back to passing again. And notice that we left the order backwards here in this case, but if we were to change it, it's still all passing. So just a way to kind of tighten everything up here to give you that amount of confidence that you need and that you want in your test to make sure it's doing the right thing. So hopefully that helps out to tighten up some of your tests.